September 1944, a rain-soaked field east of the village of Arracourt in the Lorraine region of France. German after-action reports from the Panzer brigades committed to this sector describe the same scene over and over. A German Panther tank, factory fresh, delivered to its crew less than 3 weeks earlier, sits motionless in a shallow depression 200 meters behind a tree line. Its engine is cold. Its turret is still. There is no battle damage anywhere on the hull. No shell has touched it. No mine has crippled it. The crew, 4 young men and a commander who received his promotion 6 weeks ago, are standing in the mud beside the vehicle, staring at the right side final drive housing. Something inside the gearbox has sheared. They can hear loose metal grinding when they try to engage the transmission. The tank weighs 45 tons. It is not going to move under its own power until a maintenance company with a heavy recovery vehicle, a crane, and a replacement final drive unit finds them, and no one in the regiment can say when that will be, because there are 11 other Panthers in the battalion with the same problem and only 2 replacement drives in the entire division's supply chain. 600 meters to the south, on the far side of a low ridge, the commander can hear the sound of American tank engines. Not one, several. They are Shermans. He has fought Shermans before. He knows the sound, a steady, even, mechanical note, not the high-pitched whine of the Maybach in his own vehicle. The Shermans have been moving since dawn. They moved yesterday. They moved the day before that. One of them, a platoon sergeant in the 4th Armoured Division, later told a reporter, had not stopped running for 9 days except to refuel. The German commander does not know that detail. What he knows is that those American tanks are moving, and his is not. What he knows is that the weapon in his hands, the Panther, the tank his own general staff called the finest medium tank in the world, has been killed by its own engineering before a single American gunner got the chance to try. He is not the only one. Across the German front in the autumn of 1944, from the hedgerow country of Normandy to the frozen roads of the Ardennes, German tank commanders are filing reports that contain the same observation in different words. The Panthers are breaking down. They are breaking down on approach marches before they reach the staging area. They are breaking down in assembly areas before the fighting starts. They are breaking down on roads, in fields, on bridges, and in the mud of French farmland that turns into a swamp every time it rains. The final drives fail, the transmissions seize, the engines overheat and catch fire from fuel leaks pooling near hot exhaust pipes. The interleaved road wheels clog with mud and in freezing conditions lock solid overnight, so that a tank that was running at midnight is immovable at dawn, until the crew can chip the frozen earth free with hammers and pry bars. The tanks that were supposed to turn back the Allied advance are dying not under enemy shells, but under the weight of their own complexity. And across those same fields, the American Shermans, the tanks German technical manuals dismissed as mechanically simple, underpowered, and under-armored. The tanks the Wehrmacht called adequate for training but not for serious combat, keep running. They keep running when they are hit and repaired. They keep running when their crews swap engines in a field under fire. They keep running when they have been dragged out of a ditch by a recovery vehicle at 2 in the morning, patched up by a maintenance crew working by flashlight under a tarpaulin in freezing rain, and sent back to the line by sunrise. They keep running when they have no right to keep running, and the Germans cannot explain why. To understand the answer, we have to go back, not to Normandy, not to the beaches, but to a decision made in a conference room in 1941, when the German High Command saw a Soviet tank that terrified them and decided they had to build something better. That decision would produce the most dangerous medium tank of the Second World War. It would also produce a machine that devoured itself from the inside out. And on the other side of the world, in the factories of Detroit, a completely different decision, made by men who thought about tanks the way they thought about cars, would produce a machine that was worse in almost every technical category and better in the only category that mattered. This is the story of why the tank that could kill anything on the battlefield kept breaking before it got there, and why the tank it was supposed to destroy would not stop moving long enough to be caught. The story begins in the autumn of 1941 on the plains outside Moscow, where German panzer divisions ran into a Soviet tank that no one in Berlin had told them existed. The T-34. The first German officers to encounter it in combat sent back reports that read like panic. The T-34's sloped armor deflected shells that should have penetrated. Its wide tracks gave it mobility in mud and snow that German tanks could not match. Its 76mm gun could destroy a Panzer III or a Panzer IV at ranges where the German guns could not reply. One German officer reported that his entire company had fired on a single T-34 at close range and watched every round bounce off the hull. It was, by almost every assessment written at the time, a better tank than anything the Germans had in the field. The shock went beyond the tactical. It was psychological. For 2 years, the Wehrmacht had believed that its Panzer arm represented the pinnacle of armoured warfare. The Panzer III and Panzer IV had swept through Poland, through France, through the Balkans, through the opening months of the Eastern Front, with an aura of invincibility. The T-34 shattered that aura in a single autumn. German tank crews found themselves in a machine that could not penetrate the enemy frontally and could be destroyed by the enemy at ranges they could not answer. The confidence of the Panzer arm cracked, and into that crack poured a demand from every level of the German military. We need something better. We need something that can beat the T-34. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, however fast we have to build it. That demand, and the desperation behind it, would produce the Panther, and the desperation would also be the Panther's original sin. The German response was immediate and, in hindsight, exactly the kind of response that would define everything that went wrong afterward. In November of 1941, the Army Ordnance Office dispatched a Panzer Commission to the Eastern Front. The commission visited Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army and examined captured T-34s in detail. It came back with a recommendation. Germany needed a new medium tank. It needed sloped armour. It needed a powerful gun. It needed wide tracks for the Russian mud. It needed to be better than the T-34 in every measurable way. 2 companies received contracts: MAN, Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, and Daimler-Benz. Both submitted designs. The Daimler-Benz proposal actually looked remarkably like the T-34 itself, with a forward-mounted turret, a rear-mounted drive, a diesel engine, and sloped armour that could have been drawn from the Soviet blueprint. The MAN design was more conventionally German, with a centrally mounted turret, a gasoline Maybach engine, and the interleaved road wheel suspension that German engineers considered superior for ride quality over rough terrain. Hitler initially preferred the Daimler-Benz design, but a special Panzer Commission reviewed both proposals and selected the MAN version in May of 1942, partly because its conventional turret placement allowed a larger turret ring and therefore a more powerful gun. A mild steel prototype appeared by September 1942, and then something happened that would haunt the Panther for the rest of the war. The decision was made to rush it into mass production before it had been properly tested. This was not a decision born of stupidity. It was a decision born of desperation. The Eastern Front was consuming German armour faster than German industry could replace it. Every month of delay meant more Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs being destroyed by T-34s that outclassed them. The pressure to get the Panther into the field overwhelmed the engineering process that was supposed to ensure it was ready. Finished Panthers began rolling off the assembly line in December of 1942. They were beautiful machines on paper, 45 tons. A high-velocity 75mm gun, the KWK-42, that could penetrate nearly any Allied tank on the Western Front at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Sloped frontal armour 80mm thick, a design philosophy directly inspired by the T-34's own use of angled plates. A Maybach HL230 P30 V12 engine producing 700 horsepower. A sophisticated ZFA K7-200 transmission with 7 forward gears. On a specification sheet, the Panther was the most lethal medium tank in the world. In a technical drawing, it was a masterpiece. In the field, it was something else entirely. The initial field tests identified 45 separate mechanical errors. The drive chain was unreliable. The transmission was fragile. American technical intelligence reports from 1944 would later note that approximately 5% of Panther transmissions broke within the first 100 kilometers of use, and over 90% failed before reaching 1,500 kilometers. The fuel pumps failed regularly. The engine compartment was prone to fires caused by fuel and oil leaks pooling near the exhaust manifold. 3 early production Panthers were written off as total losses due to engine fires before they ever saw combat. The Maybach engine itself had to be derated from its rated maximum of 3,000 revolutions per minute to 2,500, starting in November of 1943, just to prevent the connecting rod and bearing failures that were destroying engines at higher speeds. This reduced the Panther's top speed from roughly 34 miles per hour to 28, a sacrifice of performance for the sake of basic survival. Guderian, who had been appointed Inspector General of Armoured Troops on the 1st of March 1943, tried to convince Hitler not to commit the Panther to battle until these problems were solved. Hitler refused. The Panther had a date with the battlefield, and that date was the 5th of July 1943. Operation Citadel. The Battle of Kursk. What happened at Kursk is one of the most documented mechanical disasters in the history of armoured warfare. 200 Panthers were issued to Panzer Regiment von Lauchert, commanded by Major Meinrad von Lauchert, as part of the 48th Panzer Corps attached to the Großdeutschland Division. These were supposed to be the spearhead of the southern pincer of the greatest tank offensive the German army would ever launch. They were the weapon Hitler had delayed the entire operation to accumulate. The Panther was one of the primary reasons Citadel had been postponed repeatedly from May to July, because the Führer wanted his new tanks and heavy weapons on the field before the offensive began. 2 of them caught fire and burned during the unloading from their railway transport cars. They never reached the staging area. Of the remaining 198, by the time the regiment reached its first assembly position, 50% were already inoperative. 2/3 of those breakdowns were engine failures. 1/3 were failures of the final drive and transmission. On the 5th of July, the first day of the offensive, 184 Panthers were listed as operational. By the evening of the 6th of July, barely a day later, that number had collapsed to 40. By the 10th of July, 5 days into the largest armoured offensive in history, the regiment that was supposed to lead the breakthrough had exactly 10 operational Panthers on the front line. Guderian's assessment, compiled in the weeks following Kursk, recorded the destruction in precise terms. 25 Panthers had been totally destroyed. 23 of those were hit by enemy fire and burned. 2 had caught fire spontaneously during the approach march, killed by their own engines. 100 Panthers were in need of repair. 56 had been damaged by enemy hits and mines. 44 had broken down from purely mechanical causes. The Panther's operational rate at the end of July 1943 was 16%. It would rise to only 37% by December of that year. Guderian began referring to the Panther as his problem child. The German word was Sorgenkind. It is a word that carries a weight beyond its translation, a word a parent uses for the child who keeps failing despite everything you have invested in him. The Panther improved after Kursk. That must be said honestly. German engineers worked relentlessly on the mechanical problems. The engine fires were reduced. The transmission was strengthened. By the spring of 1944, well-supported units reported Panthers running 1,500 to 1,800 kilometers without catastrophic failure. German maintenance records show that under ideal conditions, with experienced crews and proper supply, individual Panthers could achieve far higher mileage before engine replacement was needed. These numbers prove the Panther could be made to work. But they also prove the point. Those numbers came from units with experienced crews, good maintenance sections, and adequate supply. They were the exception, not the standard. And the standard was about to be tested again. By D-Day, there were initially only 2 Panther regiments on the entire Western Front, totaling 156 vehicles. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, reported on the 1st of July 1944 that it had 32 operational Panthers. 26 were in short-term repair. 8 were in long-term repair. That is a readiness rate of barely 48% for one of the best-equipped divisions in the German army, a month into the Normandy campaign. The comparison that makes this vivid comes from the Eastern Front. When the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army moved its T-34s over 300 kilometers in 3 days to reach the Prokhorovka area, arriving by the night of the 9th of July 1943, in time to fight, 3 days later, it arrived with the vast majority of its tanks still operational. Military historian Robert Forczyk noted that no Panther unit could ever have moved this distance without losing most of its tanks to mechanical breakdown. The Soviet tank, simpler and cruder than the Panther in almost every technical respect, could survive a long road march. The Panther could not. The disaster of Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle brings the story into the sharpest focus. Formed on the 28th of July 1944 around the survivors of the destroyed Panzergrenadier Division Feldherrnhalle, the brigade was commanded by the highly decorated Oberst Dr. Franz Beeck, one of the most experienced tank commanders in the German army. Beeck's brigade was equipped with the latest Panther Ausf G variants and Jagdpanzer 4/70 tank destroyers, fresh from the factory. When committed near Mary against the United States 90th Infantry Division in early September 1944, the brigade was badly mauled. This was not a failure of leadership. Beeck was as competent a tank commander as the Wehrmacht possessed. It was a failure of the machines themselves and of the green crews who had not been given time to learn them. The brigade was crippled before the critical battles in Lorraine even began. Hold that image. 200 of the most advanced tanks on Earth, committed to the most important battle of the Eastern Front, and within 5 days, 190 of them are either destroyed or sitting in fields waiting for repairs that may never arrive. Now hold a different image. An American Sherman tank in France, in the summer of 1944. It has been running for 12 days. It has crossed 200 miles of French countryside. Its engine has not been overhauled. Its transmission has not been replaced. Its crew, 5 men from Pennsylvania and Ohio, who were working in auto plants and machine shops 2 years earlier, have performed routine maintenance every evening, checked the oil, cleaned the air filter, tightened the track tension, and in the morning the tank starts and moves. It is not a better tank than the Panther. Its gun cannot penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at standard combat ranges. Its own armor will not stop the Panther's 75mm round at any range. Man for man, gun for gun, plate for plate, the Panther is the superior machine. But the Sherman is here. The Sherman is running. The Sherman is in the fight. The Panther is 2 miles behind the line with a broken final drive and a crew waiting for a spare part that does not exist in the supply chain. This was the equation that decided the war in the West, and it was an equation that German engineers never understood because they were trained to build the best tank, and the Americans were trained to build the most tank. Every like on this video keeps these stories visible for the people who care about getting the real history right. The history that is not about which tank looked better on paper, but about which tank was still moving when it mattered. The specific weakness that killed the Panther was its final drive. The final drive is the last set of gears between the transmission and the drive sprocket that turns the tracks. In any tank, the final drive bears enormous stress. It converts the engine's power into the torque that moves 45 tons of steel across broken ground. Every time the tank accelerates, decelerates, turns, or climbs a slope, the final drive absorbs forces that would shatter components not designed to endure them. If the final drive fails, the tank does not move. It does not matter how powerful the engine is. It does not matter how lethal the gun is. It does not matter how thick the armor is, or how skilled the crew is. A tank with a dead final drive is a pillbox, a stationary gun position that cannot reposition, cannot retreat, and cannot advance, and a pillbox in the wrong place is a coffin. After the war, the French army conducted one of the most detailed technical evaluations ever performed on the Panther. The report, titled Le Panther and published in 1947, concluded that the truly weak spot of the Panther was its final drive, which was of too weak a design and had an average fatigue life of only 150 kilometers. 150 kilometers, that is 93 miles. The most feared medium tank of the war had a final drive that would, on average, fail before the tank had traveled the distance between New York and Philadelphia. The reason was not a mystery. British engineers who examined captured Panthers concluded that the final drive units had inadequate bearings, poorly hardened gears, and housing that was not strong enough for the loads imposed by a 45-ton vehicle. The drive was simply too small. It had been designed as a cost and production compromise because a properly sized final drive would have required a complete redesign of the hull. German engineers knew the drive was too weak. The proposed Panther Ausf F variant, which never entered full production, was designed to use a completely different final drive based on the Tiger tank's epicyclic system. That redesign was an implicit admission that the original had been a failure from the beginning. On the 28th of June 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day, Guderian submitted a report that captured the absurdity of the situation in a single observation. "The Panther," he wrote, "is inclined to catch fire quickly. The lifetime of the Panther's engines, (1,400 to 1,500 kilometers), is much higher than the Panther's final drives. A solution to the final drive teething is immediately needed. The engine had been fixed. It was reasonably reliable, but the final drives were still failing at a fraction of that distance. The component that mattered most, the one that determined whether the tank could move at all, was the one that had not been solved. It was as if someone had built a racing car with a superb motor and attached it to a gearbox made of glass. Now compare this to the machine the Americans put on the field. The M4 Sherman was not designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to be the most producible, the most maintainable, and the most reliable tank that American industry could manufacture in the numbers the war demanded. Its designers, working within the American automotive tradition, made choices that German engineers would have considered unacceptable compromises. The armor was not sloped on the early variants. The gun was adequate, not dominant. The silhouette was tall, making it easier to hit. But the things that German engineers considered secondary, the engine, the transmission, the final drives, the tracks, the ease of repair, those were the things American designers treated as primary. The results showed in the numbers. In June of 1943, the average Sherman service life was estimated at 1,500 miles, not 150 kilometers, 1,500 miles. The Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army, which received American M4A2 Shermans through Lend-Lease, rated their service life at 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers, roughly 1,200 to 1,600 miles, or 250 to 300 engine hours. In American trials, a single M4A3 covered 2,097 miles in 203 hours of operation. British evaluations from the same period consistently praised the Sherman's mechanical dependability, rating it superior to other available tanks, particularly in reliability, with minimal maintenance required. The gap was not a gap. It was a chasm. The Panther's final drive failed at distances the Sherman's drivetrain could cover 10 times over. The Panther needed a specialized maintenance company, a heavy crane, and a replacement part that might not exist to fix a broken final drive. The Sherman needed a crew with hand tools and a few hours. The Panther required a logistics system that could deliver scarce precision-machined components to the front line across a shattered rail network under constant Allied air attack. The Sherman required a logistics system that could deliver standardized, interchangeable parts produced by the same factories that had been making car parts for 20 years. And here is the thing that made the difference, not just a matter of engineering, but a matter of culture. The men who maintained the Shermans were not, for the most part, professional soldiers. They were the same men who had been building and fixing machines their entire civilian lives. They were auto mechanics from Detroit, farm equipment operators from Iowa, factory workers from Pittsburgh who had spent their youths pulling engines out of Ford Model A trucks on Saturday afternoons. The American Army in 1944 was, in its technical ranks, an army of tinkerers. Men who had grown up in a country where fixing your own machine was not a specialized skill. It was what you did. The United States Army built an entire support system around this culture. The echelon maintenance system divided repair responsibility into 5 levels, from the crew performing daily checks and minor fixes through battalion maintenance sections handling component swaps to ordnance companies performing major overhauls in rear area depots. The system was designed to keep the repair work as far forward as possible, because a tank being repaired 10 miles behind the front line could be back in the fight in hours, while a tank being shipped to a factory in the rear could be gone for months. This was the exact opposite of the German centralized approach, which assumed that serious repairs should be done at the factory of origin. The American approach assumed that if the men at the front could fix it, they should fix it, right where it sat. At the first echelon, the tank crew itself performed daily preventive maintenance. They checked the oil. They inspected the tracks for worn pins and broken links. They cleaned the air filters. They tested the electrical systems. They tightened what was loose and lubricated what was dry. These were not specialized skills. These were the same things any man who had ever owned a truck in rural America knew to do before he drove to town on Saturday. At the second and third echelons, battalion and company maintenance sections had mechanics who could swap out engines, replace transmissions, and rebuild road wheel assemblies in the field. A trained crew with proper equipment could pull a Sherman's engine and install a replacement in a matter of hours. Try that with a Panther, whose engine compartment was so tightly packed that removing the power plant required a substantial disassembly of the rear hull. The M32 tank recovery vehicle, standardized in June of 1943, was built on the Sherman chassis itself, which meant recovery crews already knew how to maintain their own vehicle. It carried a 60,000-pound capacity winch and an A-frame crane that could lift a Sherman engine or transmission in the field. Recovery teams would drive to a disabled tank, often under fire, hook the winch cable, and drag it back to a repair point where mechanics were already waiting with replacement parts pulled from supply trucks that had arrived that morning. Belton Cooper was an Ordnance Liaison Officer in the 3rd Armoured Division. His job was to coordinate the recovery and repair of damaged and destroyed tanks. After the war, he documented what he had witnessed. The 3rd Armoured Division had 648 Shermans completely destroyed during the war. Total losses: burned out, blown apart, unsalvageable wrecks. And yet the division's ordnance and maintenance teams returned approximately 700 damaged tanks to service during the same period. The division was, in effect, replacing itself faster than the enemy could destroy it. That was only possible because the Sherman was a machine designed from the first bolt to be repaired by the men who used it. The logistics pipeline feeding those repairs was itself an achievement that German commanders found incomprehensible. The Red Ball Express, the emergency truck supply route that operated from the 25th of August to the 16th of November 1944, was the circulatory system that kept the Allied advance alive after the breakout from Normandy. Its motor transport service truck companies, approximately 73% of whose drivers were African-American soldiers, ran a continuous loop from supply depots in the Normandy beachhead area to forward dumps near the front. At its peak, on the 29th of August 1944, the Red Ball Express operated 132 truck companies, running 5,958 vehicles that carried 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. Over its entire operational life, it delivered 412,193 tons. That included fuel, ammunition, food, and the thing that mattered most to the tank crews, spare parts. If someone in your family served in the Second World War, in any branch, any theatre, any role, I would be honoured to hear their story in the comments. What unit were they in? Where did they serve? What did they remember? Those details are the real history, the kind that no archive can replace, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Now we need to look at the other side of the ledger. We need to look at why the German maintenance system, which had worked well enough in the short campaigns of Poland and France, collapsed under the demands of a long war fought across vast distances on multiple fronts. The official American post-war study of this collapse is one of the most quietly devastating documents to come out of the entire conflict. It is Department of the Army pamphlet 20-202, titled German Tank Maintenance in World War II, published on the 25th of June, 1954, and later republished as Center of Military History Publication 104-7. Its principal author was General German Mueller Hillebrand, a former German officer who had served as aide to the Chief of the Army General Staff before commanding an armoured regiment on the Eastern Front and later serving as Chief of Staff of a Panzer Corps and a Panzer Army. He was not an outsider guessing at what went wrong. He was a man who had lived through the failure he was documenting. Mueller Hillebrand's conclusions read like a confession written on behalf of an entire military establishment. Germany, he wrote, had planned a centralized maintenance system in which seriously damaged tanks were returned to the factory of origin for repair. This system worked in the short campaigns of 1939 through 1941, when the distances were manageable and the rail network was intact. It collapsed completely in Russia, where the distances were enormous, the conditions were extreme, and the rail infrastructure was primitive or destroyed. The centralized system, he wrote, was no longer practical. But the problem was deeper than logistics. With its limited industrial capacity, Mueller Hillebrand wrote, Germany was unable to produce more new tanks and a satisfactory amount of spare parts at the same time. The armoured forces therefore suffered from a constant shortage of tank spare parts until the end of the war. This is a sentence that deserves to sit with you for a moment. The German army, for the entire duration of the war, never had enough spare parts to keep its tanks running, not because it could not manufacture them, because it chose to manufacture new tanks instead. And the problem compounded itself. The number of tank models and types within each series issued to the field forces increased steadily, Mueller Hillebrand wrote, which in turn had an adverse effect on the efficiency of the maintenance services. Germany was simultaneously fielding the Panzer IV, the Panther, the Tiger I, the Tiger II, the Sturmgeschütz, 3 assault gun, and dozens of other variants of self-propelled guns and tank destroyers built on different chassis, each requiring different spare parts, different tools, and different technical expertise. A maintenance sergeant in a German panzer division might be responsible for keeping operational 4 completely different types of armoured vehicle, each with its own engine, its own transmission, its own final drive, and its own set of components that were not interchangeable with anything else in the battalion. The Americans, by contrast, had the Sherman. 1 basic tank, multiple engine options, yes. The Continental R975 radial, the Ford GAAV8, the Chrysler A57 multibank, the General Motors 6046 twin diesel. But the hull, the turret, the running gear, the tracks, the final drives, the hatches, the gun mounts, the periscopes, the radios, virtually every component that a crew or a maintenance section would need to replace in the field were interchangeable across all variants. A replacement road wheel, manufactured by one company in Ohio, would bolt directly onto a Sherman built by a completely different company in Michigan. The maintenance sergeant's job was not to remember 4 different machines, it was to know one machine absolutely. Mueller Hillebrand's most damning conclusion went even further. The Germans, he wrote, would have done better to retain one standard tank model, as the Russians did with their T-34, and forget about improvements, than to constantly introduce new and improved versions for which no spare parts were available. In general, a few weeks after a new shipment of tanks arrived at the Russian front, most of the vehicles were deadlined, and many became a total loss, simply because parts whose installation would have required only a few hours were missing. Read that again. Tanks that could have been repaired with a few hours of work were lost permanently because a single replacement part did not exist in the supply chain. This was not a failure of engineering. It was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of philosophy. The German military establishment believed that the way to win a war was to build the most advanced weapon possible. The American military establishment believed the way to win a war was to build a weapon that would still be working when the fighting started. Both beliefs were sincere. Only one of them survived contact with reality. The spare parts crisis grew catastrophically worse as the war progressed. German production records show that in 1943, spare parts production accounted for roughly 25 to 30% of total tank production capacity. By late 1944, under the combined pressure of Allied strategic bombing, raw material shortages, and the decision to prioritize new vehicle assembly, that figure had fallen to approximately 8%. German units in the field were reduced to cannibalizing broken tanks for parts, stripping one dead Panther to keep another alive. By 1944, some panzer divisions had more tanks waiting for repair than they had tanks that could fight. Military analysts would later describe this as an unsustainable maintenance debt, a deficit that compounded with every passing week because every tank stripped for parts was one more tank that would never return to service. There was another factor, one that German engineers understood perfectly well but could do nothing about. The Panther's final drive gears required specific alloy steels to achieve proper hardness and wear resistance. Germany's access to critical alloying metals had been severely curtailed by Allied naval blockade and the loss of mining territories. The replacement gears being manufactured in late 1944 were made with inferior steel compositions that wore faster and failed sooner. The final drive that had lasted 150 kilometers in the French post-war test may have been, by the standards of late-war German production, an optimistic estimate. The drives being installed in Panthers rolling off the line in the autumn of 1944, hardened with substitute alloys that could not match the specifications the engineers had originally demanded, were likely failing even sooner. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, saw all of this and said so. Following an inspection trip to the Italian front between the 19th and the 25th of October 1944, Speer filed a report in November of that year that contained observations his own engineers did not want to hear. On the southwestern front, Speer wrote, "Opinions are in favor of the Sherman tank and its cross-country ability. According to reports from the 26th Panzer Division, The terrain crossing ability on level ground is completely superior to our panzers. In his post-war memoir, Inside the Third Reich, Speer returned to the same observation. The Sherman, he wrote, climbs mountains that German tank experts considered inaccessible to tanks, and its cross-country mobility on level ground was definitely superior to German armor. This is the Reich Minister of Armaments, the man personally responsible for German weapons production, writing in an official report that the enemy's tank, the tank his own engineers dismissed as inferior, was outperforming German armor in the field, not because it had a better gun, not because it had thicker armor, because it worked, because it kept moving across ground that German tanks could not cross, because the ratio of its engine power to its weight was correct, and the ratio in the Panther, despite the Maybach's 700 horsepower, was not correct, because too much of that horsepower was being consumed by the friction of an overloaded drivetrain that was slowly tearing itself apart. Speer understood the broader pattern too. He criticized the super-heavy Maus tank project for consuming enormous resources that could have produced multiple Tiger tanks and for creating insoluble supply and spare parts problems. He saw the disease. He named it. He could not cure it because the disease was not a failure of any single component. It was a failure of the entire German approach to weapons design, an approach that prized performance over reliability, complexity over simplicity, and the perfect over the functional. After the war, German generals wrote their memoirs and offered their explanations for why they had lost. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, who published Panzer Battles in 1956, attributed defeat primarily to the enemy's immense and seemingly inexhaustible resources, and spoke of endless waves of men and tanks that overwhelmed qualitatively superior German forces. This became the dominant German post-war narrative. We were better. They simply had more. It was comforting. It was also incomplete. Historians Ronald Smelser and Edward Davies classified these accounts as exculpatory memoirs, narratives carefully constructed to preserve the reputation of the German officer corps by framing the defeat as one of quantity, not quality. Robert Citino separately called such works unreliable and, at worst, deliberately misleading. What those memoirs left out was the truth that Mueller Hillebrand, writing for an American audience in an official study, was willing to state plainly. The quality the Germans prized in their tanks was the wrong kind of quality. It was the quality of the laboratory, not the quality of the battlefield. A tank that could destroy anything it faced but could not travel 93 miles without breaking was not a superior weapon. It was a superior prototype. Now, look at what this meant on an actual battlefield. The Battle of Arracourt in September 1944 is the clearest illustration of the reliability gap, deciding a real engagement. The German 5th Panzer Army committed the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades against the United States 4th Armored Division, specifically Combat Command A under Colonel Bruce Clark, part of Major General John Wood's division. The German brigades were equipped with new Panthers and Panzer IVs. The Panthers were factory fresh. Their crews were not. Many had not trained together. Many of the tank commanders had never fought in a Panther before. The battle lasted from the 18th to the 29th of September. Heavy fog in the Lorraine Valley negated the Panther's greatest tactical advantage, its ability to engage and destroy targets at long range with its superior gun. In the fog, engagements happened at close range where the Sherman's gun could penetrate Panther side and rear armor, and where crew skill, coordination, and vehicle reliability mattered more than technical specifications. The Americans used terrain and flanking maneuvers to devastating effect. The results tell the story. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns the Germans deployed in the Arracourt area, 86 were destroyed, 114 were damaged or broken down, and only 62 were operational at the end of the month. Combat Command A lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The exchange ratio in destroyed vehicles favored the Americans by more than 3-1. And a significant portion of those 114 German vehicles listed as damaged or broken down were not combat casualties at all. They were mechanical failures. Panthers that had broken down on the approach march. Panthers whose final drives had failed during the battle. Panthers that had been abandoned by their crews because there was no recovery vehicle available and no spare part within 50 miles. Arracourt was not an anomaly. It was the pattern of the entire campaign in the West. The Panther could kill any Allied tank it could see. but it could not reliably get to the place where it needed to see them. And once it broke down, it was gone, not for hours, not for days, but often permanently, because the maintenance system behind it could not keep pace with the rate at which the machine consumed itself. In December of 1944, during the Ardennes offensive, the pattern repeated at the strategic level. Kampfgruppe Piper, the armoured spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, began the offensive with roughly 40 Panthers, 40 Panzer IVs, and a number of attached Tiger II heavy tanks. Piper was one of the most aggressive armoured commanders in the entire SS. His reputation was built on speed and ruthlessness. His mission was to race through the American lines, seize bridges over the Meuse River, and open the road to Antwerp. Speed was everything. The entire strategic logic of the Ardennes offensive depended on the Panzer spearheads reaching their objectives before the Americans could recover from the initial shock and reinforce. The plan required continuous forward movement across terrain that Piper himself described as fit for bicycles, not panzers. The Kampfgruppe was halted not primarily by American resistance, though American resistance was fierce and growing fiercer by the hour, but by a combination of fuel shortages, impossible terrain, and mechanical attrition. Panthers broke down on narrow forest roads. Recovery was impossible because the roads were too narrow for a recovery vehicle to pass a stalled tank. Abandoned Panthers blocked the advance of the vehicles behind them, creating traffic jams that cascaded backward through the column. By the 24th of December, 8 days into the offensive, Piper was out of fuel and surrounded at La Glaise. He abandoned all his remaining vehicles, every tank, every half-track, every gun, and led approximately 717 survivors out on foot through the woods under cover of darkness. The Panthers he left behind were not all battle casualties. Many of them had simply stopped running. Throughout the Ardennes offensive, roughly 40% of all Panthers committed were lost by mid-January 1945. Reports from the period note that breakdowns due to poor quality control during manufacture were increasingly common, as were those resulting from inexperienced and undertrained crews. The Panther was failing at every level simultaneously. The machine was unreliable. The parts were unavailable. The crews were too green to perform preventive maintenance. And the logistics system that was supposed to keep all of it functioning had collapsed under the weight of 4 years of attrition, bombing, and strategic overextension. Meanwhile, the Shermans kept running. This is not mythology. It is not national pride dressed up as history. It is documented, measured, and verified. American armored units in the European theater of operations routinely maintained operational readiness rates above 90% for their Sherman fleets. For every 10 Shermans in a company, 9 were available to fight on any given morning. The German equivalent for Panther-equipped units was rarely above 60% and frequently fell below 50%. On some days, in some divisions, it was 35% or less. The 4th Armoured Division, which fought across France and into Germany, calculated after the war that on an average day it had 92% of its medium tanks available for operations. A German Panzer division equipped with Panthers considered 60% operational to be a good day. The meaning of that gap becomes clear when you multiply it across an entire theatre of war. If the Americans had 6,000 Shermans in the European theatre and kept 90% running, they had 5,400 tanks ready to fight every morning. If the Germans had 1,000 Panthers in the West and kept 50% running, they had 500. The numerical advantage was not just about how many tanks you built. It was about how many of those tanks were still moving when the sun came up. The Panther's unreliability was not a footnote to its combat record. It was the defining feature of its combat record, because every Panther sitting dead in a field with a broken final drive was a Panther that was not in the fight, and a fight that a Sherman won by default. The reason was not that the Sherman was indestructible. It was not. The Sherman burned when hit by high-velocity anti-tank rounds, and its crews knew it and feared it. Its armour was thin by 1944 standards. Its early 75mm gun was inadequate against the Panther's frontal plate. American tankers knew all of this, and many of them were bitterly angry about it. But the Sherman came back. When it was hit and did not burn, it was recovered. When its engine failed, the engine was swapped. When its track was blown off by a mine, the track was replaced in the field with links carried on the hull. When it was knocked out in the morning, it was often fighting again by evening, Because the men who repaired it carried the parts in a truck, and the knowledge in their hands, and the habit in their bones. That habit is the part of the story the Germans never quite grasped. They understood logistics, they understood spare parts, they understood assembly lines. What they did not understand was what it meant to field an army of men who had grown up in a country where every family had a car, where every small town had a garage, where teenage boys spent their weekends taking apart engines and putting them back together for fun. The American tank crew did not treat their Sherman the way a German crew treated their Panther. The German crew revered their machine. The American crew used theirs. The German crew waited for a specialist. The American crew grabbed a wrench. The total production numbers frame the cultural difference in the starkest possible terms. The United States produced 49,324 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1946. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers in roughly the same period. The Americans built more than 8 Shermans for every single Panther, and each of those Shermans was simpler to build, simpler to maintain, simpler to repair, and simpler to return to the fight. The factories that built the Sherman were themselves a reflection of the philosophy that made it work. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant, which began tank production with the M3 Lee in 1941 and shifted to Sherman production in 1942, applied automotive assembly line methods to tank manufacture. Ford built Shermans at its Highland Park facility. Fisher Body, a division of General Motors that had spent decades building car bodies, built them too. Pressed Steel Car Company, American Locomotive, Lima Locomotive Works, Pacific Car and Foundry, Federal Machine and Welder, all of them poured Shermans off their lines, using the same principles of standardization, interchangeable parts, and mass production that Henry Ford had pioneered 30 years earlier. The philosophy inside those factories was explicit. The Army ground forces wanted mature, reliable vehicles. Design changes were kept to an absolute minimum because every change meant retooling, and retooling meant fewer tanks. The engineering teams understood that tanks built in Detroit, only to break down in France, were worse than worthless. So they designed the Sherman to be what an automobile was supposed to be. A machine that started in the morning, ran all day, and could be fixed by any competent mechanic with a standard set of tools. The German approach was the opposite. German tank design grew out of a craft engineering tradition that prized performance, protection, and precision. The interleaved road wheel suspension on the Panther was mechanically elegant but nightmarish to maintain. Replacing an inner road wheel required removing multiple outer wheels first, a task that could take hours in the field. The Sherman used a simple horizontal volute spring suspension. It was not as smooth a ride. It was not as elegant. But a damaged road wheel could be unbolted and replaced in minutes, in the field, under fire if necessary. The arithmetic of the war was not a contest between the best tank and the second best tank. It was a contest between a philosophy that believed in the perfect weapon and a philosophy that believed in the weapon that works. So here is the answer to the question that the German tank commander in that rain-soaked field near Arracourt could not answer. Why were the Shermans still running? They were still running because they had been designed to run by men who understood that a weapon is only as good as the number of days it is available for use. They were still running because they were backed by a supply chain that could deliver a replacement part from a factory in Michigan to a repair depot in France in less time than it took a German requisition form to travel from a Panzer division headquarters to the Army Ordnance Office in Berlin. They were still running because the men who crewed them and the men who fixed them were products of the same industrial culture that had built the tanks in the first place, a culture that did not ask whether a machine was elegant, it asked whether the machine worked. The Panther was the superior weapon in a duel. Nobody disputes that. In a controlled engagement, 1 against 1, on open ground with a trained crew, the Panther won almost every time. But wars are not fought in controlled engagements. Wars are fought across months and years, across thousands of miles of mud and snow, in rain and freezing cold, by men who are tired and scared, and do not have time to wait for a precision-machined replacement gear that may never arrive. In that war, the real war, the Sherman was the superior system, not the superior tank. The superior system. Mueller Hillebrand, writing his confession for the American Army in 1954, reached the same conclusion by a different road. Keep one standard model. Forget about improvements. Make sure the parts are available. The Americans had done exactly that without anyone telling them to, because the men who designed the Sherman had come from an industrial tradition where that was simply how you built things. You did not build one perfect car for a king. You built 1,000,000 adequate cars for everyone, and when one broke down, you fixed it on the side of the road and kept driving. The irony is that the German engineers who designed the Panther were not wrong about what they valued. Firepower matters. Armor protection matters. Optical superiority matters. Every one of those advantages saved German tank crews' lives in individual engagements. The 75mm KWK-42 was a magnificent weapon. The Panther's frontal armor was genuinely formidable. In the right circumstances, with a good crew, on favorable ground, the Panther was the most dangerous tank any Allied soldier could face. But the right circumstances were becoming rarer every week, because the machine that was supposed to create those circumstances could not get to the battlefield reliably enough to create them consistently. The German commander near Arracourt, standing in the mud beside his dead Panther, hearing the sound of Shermans on the far side of the ridge, was listening to the sound of a different industrial civilization. He was listening to the sound of an army that had solved the problem his army had chosen to ignore. Not the problem of how to build the most dangerous tank, the problem of how to keep the tank running when everything around it was falling apart. The Americans did not solve that problem with genius. They solved it with habit. They solved it with a culture that had been fixing machines for a living since before most of those soldiers were born. They solved it with spare parts and wrenches and recovery vehicles and maintenance crews who did not know they were supposed to wait for an expert, because where they came from, you were the expert. The Panther's final drive lasted 93 miles. The Sherman's drivetrain lasted more than 1,000. That is not a statistic. That is a verdict. It is the verdict on 2 ways of building a weapon, 2 ways of fighting a war, and 2 ways of thinking about what matters when the shooting starts. The Germans built the better tank. The Americans built the better war. If this story gave you something to think about, subscribe for the next chapter. There are many stories like this one. Stories about the men and the machines and the decisions that decided the largest conflict in human history. Most of them are not about the weapon that looked best on paper. They are about the weapon that was still working when the paper was long since lost in the mud. And the men who kept it working deserve to be remembered not for the machine they rode into battle, but for the fact that when the machine broke, they fixed it, and when it broke again, they fixed it again, and they kept fixing it until the war was over and they could finally go home.